Welcome back to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Gordon Coyle. In today's episode, we chat with John Trofimo, who's a partner in the law firm of Moret, Haack, and Hamroff. We're going to talk about employment and cybersecurity legal issues, which of course are very relevant today and in the news just about every day. Before we begin our conversation, I just want to thank you for listening and ask that if you haven't subscribed or rated the show, hit that subscription button and rate this podcast on the platform you're listening to it on. And if you have an interesting story and would like to tell it on this podcast, let me know. Drop me an email, which I'll have in the show notes, and let's chat. Now, on to the show.
Welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast, presented by the Coyle Group. We interview the most interesting and influential business leaders in New York and hear their stories of success, challenges, and lessons learned while building their businesses and personal brands. New episodes drop weekly, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates in your favorite stream. Without further delay, here's your host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast, Gordon Coyle.
Hey everybody, I'm Gordon Coyle. Welcome back to the show. This is the New York Business Leaders Podcast, and today I have with me John Trofimo, who's a partner at Moret, Haack, and Hamroff, an attorney specializing in employment law and cybersecurity law. And we're really glad, John, to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so these are the early shows. I'm not sure when this is going to be released. So for the listeners, if this is a little choppy, I apologize. I'm still getting used to being a host of a podcast show. So John, why don't you take a couple minutes and tell us about yourself and your practice?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been a lawyer for over 30 years. I started out skipping a couple of things, but as a government lawyer, which I did really to learn how to try cases. And I tried a number of cases in federal court. Loved being a government lawyer with the sole exception of, it wasn't financially rewarding and it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun. And I then went into private practice. I went to a big firm in Manhattan and I was there for about 12 years. And I left there to come to Moret Haack, my present firm, where I've been for the last 12 years.
And Moret Haack is a fairly good sized firm, isn't it?
We're about 75 lawyers, maybe a few more than that at this point, with our main office on Long Island in Garden City, but a nice, robust, bustling office at 39th and Broadway in Manhattan.
Great. So tell us a little bit about the employment law, and then we'll kind of talk about how you transitioned also into cyber. What do you see as the big issues in employment law today? What are you seeing from your clients? What are the things you're involved in on a daily basis?
Yeah, for sure. So to do both, right? Number one, how I got into employment law.
Okay.
Right. So I mentioned that I started at the government, right, working for this as an assistant corporation counsel for the city, first of Chicago, and then when we moved to New York for the city of New York. And in terms of substantive law, when I worked for the city, I did sort of two main areas. One was civil rights defense for the municipality, and then the other was employment law. And once you leave working for the government, it's hard to earn a living on the management side for civil rights work. So that kind of encouraged me to look more and more at employment law, and there was a ready market for that. And I've always really found employment law super interesting. It's really all about helping people manage dysfunctional relationships, Gordon. I wish I could tell you it was more than that.
I mean, so you're part legal counselor, part therapist. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, the therapist recipients, in addition to myself, right, would be our clients, but the people involved are maybe, having issues getting along with each other. And, when people don't get along, and the law gives them a label that if you fit under that label, right, here's how you might be able to recover. So then they tend to go to those labels. And a lot of it is working, and sometimes with merit, right? Sometimes those claims have merit to them, and sometimes I think there's not so much merit. And it's about trying to help our clients manage those relationships so that they don't find themselves in court at all. I find that to be super important and very rewarding when we can do that.
And tell us about some of those labels. What are big things that you're seeing on the employment side today that business owners are, really struggling with?
Yeah, I mean, for sure today, I think it's all COVID, right? That's the big issue. And one of the really big case, I'm actually writing a blog post on it, and that's going up over the next day or two, is on that decision down in Texas with Houston Methodist Hospital, where the hospital required by policy that their workers, that their employees be vaccinated. And a large number of them sued, saying that they didn't think they should have to be vaccinated as a condition of their employment. And the federal judge ruled squarely and vociferously in favor of the hospital, and absolutely said that that policy was lawful. So that's, to my knowledge, Gordon, and maybe there's a federal court decision out there that I've not seen, but that's the first federal court decision I've seen that has squarely answered the question, at least in that context, right? We are talking about a hospital there, right? How a different judge in a different part of the country, not dealing with a hospital, we'll have to see. But this is the first very aggressive, clear answer from a federal judge, affirming the rights of an employer to require that their employees be vaccinated as a condition of returning to work.
Interesting. And, not to get political about it, but a judge in a very conservative state that tends to be very, hey, do what you want kind of a thing. So interesting that they were so strongly worded about, that the employer was right in asking for vaccines. But that was a hospital setting. So you could have other situations, it could be an employer in a white collar business in New York City that may face the same sort of a thing, or it could be any number of different sorts of issues that employers are going to face today. So outside of employers mandating vaccination and then getting sued for it, what other kinds of litigation do you think employers are going to see around COVID?
Right. So look, one of the things that federal judge in Texas did is he said he wasn't bound by it, but he referenced with approval the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's guidance that really, also says that you can force people back to work, but a couple of big caveats, right? You have to reasonably accommodate disabilities and sincerely held religious beliefs. Right. So I think astutely point out, Gordon, facts matter, right? So a white collar person who can do their job remotely may be very differently situated than a hospital worker who presumably can't do their job remotely. Right. And, I think that employers will not only be looking at what their legal options are, but there are economic incentives here too. One thing to think about, right? Our employers going to decide that flexibility with remote working is a recruitment and retention advantage. And they're going to do it even beyond what the law requires because they're going to think it makes good business sense to do that. And I think different employers are going to come up with different answers to that question.
And each one of these questions and answers presents a legal challenge to make sure that it's documented properly. One of the concerns I have is a business says, okay, we're going to be really flexible and you can work from home because we see that it's just as productive. But what happens if the pendulum swings the other way and in 2 years, the employer says, you know what, productivity has really dropped off. We've got to bring people back. So this is kind of a challenge for employers, isn't it? Like from a legal perspective, and what you do today could have implications down the road.
Right. I mean, you always, or think about it this way. Let's say you recruit somebody, and they move halfway across the country and they do so with an understanding that you're going to let them telecommute 3 days a week. Right. And so they've really relied on that promise that you've made them, right, to take your job. And then you as an employer decide, well, you know what, it's nothing personal to you, Gordon, but this isn't working for us as a policy basis and we need to change it. And there could be some interesting fact patterns that come out of that.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaway for me is that you need to really kind of be thoughtful about this, have it well documented, and I'll even put a little pitch in and say, buy EPLI insurance.
That's been a good thing for employers to think about long before COVID. And, there's every reason to think that it'll be a good thing for employers to think about for years to come.
For sure. So let's transition a little bit. And I want to ask you, how did you go from employment law into cybersecurity law? How did that transition take place?
Yeah. So, part of it, Gordon, you and I, have known each other a long time. And I think we both see in each other, people who are just intellectually engaged and curious with the world. And, as I got to know some lawyers at my firm, but also outside my firm, who were getting involved in this emerging area of cybersecurity, I was interested about it. And the more I thought about it, the more connections I saw between, and this is going to maybe be counterintuitive at first, but between what is often thought of as a low-tech world, right, employment law, and a high-tech world of cybersecurity. Well, what are those connections? Well, number one, right, you need to have clear policies. You need to understand what you're going to do, right? So what do you do in the cyber world? You put together often, a written information security plan or a WISP. Well, when you think about it for a second, the parallels between a WISP and an employee handbook, right, there are some real parallels. What are you doing? You're setting the rules that your organization is going to live by, and you're thinking them through as carefully as you can, and you're committing them to writing so that people can understand what they are. Then once you've got those rules in place, what do you need to do? You need to teach your employees what they are. You need to train people on them. Well, again, what does that look like? That looks like training your employees on discrimination and harassment modalities that you have at your company. Then you need to enforce your policies, and that involves doing investigations, making judgments, right? So, while maybe somebody else might not have seen these as being similar fields, like I saw them as really having a lot in common. And, fortunately, there's others at my firm who can handle the technical side of it. But I found that there's sort of a real value towards, looking at cybersecurity as having real points of intersection with employment law. And in fact, on the cybersecurity side, it's amazing what a high percentage of the violations or of the problems are caused by current or former employees, right? So they're the ones who leave the keys unlocked. And so, I think it actually turned out to be a very interesting and useful way to expand my practice.
Yeah, and I could see the parallels between the two. And you kind of mentioned it early on that in employment law, you're handling dysfunctional relationships. And I think that a lot of that carries over to cybersecurity. It's a big piece of what I do and what I talk to my clients about. And unfortunately, I believe too many employers kind of slough it off as like, it's not going to happen to me. It's not that important. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But you mentioned that the root of most problems in cybersecurity are employees that don't follow rules, that don't do training, that don't, understand the training, that don't get reinforced. There's no accountability. So let's just start with a really basic question I want to ask about. You mentioned a WISP, which stands for Written Information Security Plan. What size employer should be looking at having a WISP, and what's its function inside an organization?
It's a great question. Look, the legal incentives to have a WISP apply to employers of any size, organizations of any size, right? The economic issue is that you can make them more or less expensive to a degree, but as a general proposition, they're not cheap. And so there's a real economic challenge for very small companies to engage with that process and decide that, they're going to, in fact, make that investment, even though there's no question that they have strong legal incentives to do it. And so what I do see happening, and you may have even better insights into this than I do in terms of, helping write cyber policies for companies. But my sense of it is that smaller and smaller organizations are figuring out that this is for them, that they need to come into compliance. They need to have cyber insurance. They need to do what they can to reduce risk. Now, are you going to be able to insulate yourself from a breach if a state actor, a sophisticated state actor, devotes enough resources at you? Probably not. But you're going to be a lot more secure. But even if you are breached, think about it this way. So you're in a courtroom, there's been a breach. You've got 1,000 employees or other people whose private information you housed, and it was hacked and it was breached, and they've been injured, and they come into a courtroom and all of this is undisputed, and you have to explain to a jury why you should not be held liable for that, right? So you're going in a tough spot, right? So how do you do it? Well, I think the best argument that you can make is to say, look, we did everything that we could be expected to do. And that's where you need the documentation, right? So if I can go to my CEO, let's call him Gordon, and I can say, okay, Gordon, I'm going to show you Exhibit A. What is Exhibit A? And you say, oh, it's our WISP. And I'm going to say, okay, well, why did you decide to do this? And you give some, variation on the theme of, I wanted our data to be as secure as we could possibly make it. And then I spend, several hours walking you through that document and letting you explain, as the CEO, all of the steps that you oversaw to make sure that the data you were housing was as secure as it could possibly be. And then the answer is, well, what happened? And your answer is, as I understand it, from the best cybersecurity minds that we've been able to find, an incredibly sophisticated state or private actor just overcame everything that we had done. And there was just literally nothing more that a company of our size and with our resources could have done to protect this data. Maybe you win, maybe you lose, but at least you've got a strong, credible, presentation to give to that jury.
Yeah. So maybe, I know a lot of listeners may have heard the term WISP or heard the term Written Information Security Plan, but can you give us just briefly what that document contains? Is it, in case of emergency, break glass kind of a thing? Or is it like, as I understand it, it's kind of like pre-event and post-event kind of documentation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's both, right? So I say this kind of tongue in cheek, but partly serious too. One of the first things you do with your WISP is what? You print it, right? Right? So that if your computers, are not available to you, you have it, right?
Yeah.
That's the break glass. It's an emergency. Right. So what does your WISP do? Essentially, it targets a set of standards, and there's different standards that apply to different industries and different contexts. And what you do is you map your network security against that standard. So what are you going to do? One thing you'll do is you'll identify all of your assets. Well, where do we have hardware and where do we have software? And have we identified everything that we have? Okay, now that we've identified everything we have, what are we doing to protect those assets? So, and you're documenting all of this, right? So all of our laptops, right, they're dual authenticated, right? We have physical procedures to maintain physical custody of them, right? We have policies against, I'm being a little tongue in cheek here, but taping the password onto the laptop so that the user doesn't have to look for it. We've identified all of our assets. We've taken steps to protect it, right? So now if there's a breach, right, do we have steps in place to recover our assets to the extent that we can, right? So we've got, a disaster recovery plan. We've got protocols in place that are thoughtful, that are mapped against the specific resources that we've identified that comprise the different aspects of our network, and we have recovery plans, right? And then we have things like, well, who do we call, right? So our broker, Gordon Coyle, is going to be on that list, right? Because we're going to have insurance obligations. Who else do we call? Well, obviously you call your lawyer. Who else are you going to call? Well, maybe you're going to have a pre-existing relationship with a crisis management firm, because depending on how big you are and how sophisticated you are, this might be, newsworthy, and you're going to want to be able to get out ahead of that story. What a WISP really does, if done well, it forces you as the CEO and your team, Gordon, to think through what it would happen to you. What would you want to do if, you were hit with a really serious interruption of service or some other attack on your network?
Right. So whether it's cyber, in my world, whether it's cyber, workers' compensation, general liability, property insurance, whatever line of business we talk about in insurance, I'm a strong believer in managing those risks, which means preventing claims from occurring because it's much cheaper to prevent a claim from occurring than having your insurance company pay for it, because there's always going to be indirect, ancillary costs that don't get reimbursed by insurance. And then having a strategy in place for all lines of business, for all your business risks, that if something does happen that you can't prevent from occurring, you have a strategy to help mitigate the impact of that hit. And I think in cyber, that's more true than probably any other line of business because the risk is so prevalent today. But I wanted to ask, let's get back to just where do you see it most practical from a size perspective of an employer, a business saying, yes, I should do a WISP, or I should do something like a WISP and maybe integrate with John and my managed service provider, my IT firm, to put something together. But give us an idea of what size firm is best suited for these ideas.
I think with WISP, there's clearly an economy of scale, right? So it is cheaper as a fraction of your total wealth, right? If you're, the wealthier the organization is, because while a larger organization will have more sophisticated needs and the WISP will be more expensive, it's probably not going to be proportionately more expensive relative to their resources, right? So I think the way I would look at it is, number one, is your company growing, right? Number two, what is your line of business? So what kind of data are you storing? Are you touching healthcare data? I mean, how can you not? Are you touching?
How can you not have a WISP if you're touching healthcare data?
Correct.
Okay, because of HIPAA rules.
Well, among everything else, but yeah, HIPAA, and what's it going to do to your business model?
Yeah, exactly.
If it gets out that you were hacked and you weren't well protected.
Right.
Like I'm going back to your point, Gordon, which I agree with 100%, that there are non-insurable costs that, business reputation is a great example of that.
Yep.
And those are going to be, I would think, devastating in the healthcare area. Let's say you're a Department of Defense contractor. Well, how could you not?
Right.
Right.
You only get one chance,
Yeah. Right. So you have to look at that. I think the truth of the matter is, as cybersecurity becomes more and more of an issue at every level, and there's no question that it is, the need to have a WISP is only growing. I think the presumption going in is, frankly, that a business needs a WISP. The only reason not to have one is if they just make the business decision, and you run into this with insurance all the time, right? That someone makes a business decision that they'd rather run the risk than pay for the protection. And I think a WISP is akin to that, right? You should have it. The only reason not to is if you've just made the business decision that you'd rather run the risk than sort of do the prudent thing.
Yeah, I agree. In my experience, I think that a lot of business owners, regardless of the size, are resistant to buying more insurance or spending the money on the right documentation. And even if you talk to several managed service providers, IT experts, they even tell me some businesses are just resistant to spending money on new hardware, updating software, whatever it may be. So John, what I see, regardless of the size of the business, we've got businesses that are just reluctant to spend money on cyber insurance, spend money on a WISP, spend money on updating hardware and software, or even really spending time talking about it. I don't know what that is, whether that's just reluctance to spend the dollars or spend the time focusing on what's important. What's your take on it? It's got to be more than the dollars at play, because we're not talking about a tremendous sum of money relative to the risk that we're talking about. Do you think business owners just don't understand those risks? What's your feeling?
I do think there's a component of that. Number one, they don't quite appreciate the risks and how devastating they could be. Number two, when there was some of the this is pre-pandemic, right? Some of the multi-billion-dollar corporations got hit with very high-profile lawsuits, and that kind of focused attention on this issue. But I think a lot of middle market companies may have thought, well, that's not really our issue, that's their issue. And I don't think the awareness is really kind of spread down into the middle market as much as it will. And I would contrast that with the employment area, where so many companies have been sued for some form of employment or wage and hour violations that everyone kind of understands to a much greater degree than in the cyber area, that it's just a risk of doing business, that you're going to get hit with an employment claim. And I think there's another point of contrast between the employment and the cyber areas in this regard. And again, I think you might have great insights into this. A reasonably wealthy company can decide whether they do it intentionally or by default to self-insure for an employment claim. I mean, typically, you're talking about six figures, maybe you'll get into the low seven figures. Millions, right? The low millions, right? In an insurance, in an EPL case or in an employment case where, a company will feel it, but they can probably survive if they're a relatively robust middle market company. But cyber is not necessarily that way, right? If you get hit with a cyber litigation or regulatory matter where you're caught without being in compliance, you're the kind of organization that should have a much more robust network security infrastructure. That's much more likely, I think, and particularly in the absence of insurance, to be an existential threat to the business. I'm just wondering if that makes sense to you as well.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that regardless of the size of the business, because I think that, a small business owner with 25 employees or a middle market firm with 2,500 employees, the risks scale appropriately between the two firms. Right. And the costs associated, with protecting themselves, a WISP and a cyber insurance program for the 25 employee firm is going to be reasonably priced. And the one with the 2,500 employees is going to be reasonably priced for their size. And I think the offset is that it's kind of like the old Fram oil filters. You can pay me now or you can pay me later. You can pay me now to have a qualified attorney write up the WISP and buy cyber insurance. And for the small firm, maybe that's, I'm going to make up a number, $10,000. On the larger firm, let's say it's $100,000. What are the corresponding cost factors if you don't do those things? Well, one ransom attack is going to be on the small firm size is going to be $50, $80, $100,000 out of pocket. On the large firm size, it's going to be $4, $5 to $10 million. Everything is going to scale appropriately. And I think that the pennies on the dollar kind of concept comes into play. But still, with that, I think a lot of business owners just don't think it's ever going to happen to me, or it's never going to happen as badly as it did for Colonial Pipeline or whoever the victim was. Yeah, we can talk statistics all day long until we're blue in the face about what these things cost. I just read this morning, I subscribed to a newsletter, KnowBe4, which I think is really great, that 80% of organizations that get hit by ransomware attack are hit a second time. And I'm like, holy cow. So you're gonna lose your data or have it held hostage, and then again, like you have an 80% chance to get hit again. If that doesn't scare the what out of you, then what are you waiting for? So, and I can get crazy about this, I admit.
Well, and I would just point out that the denial of service kind of attack that you're talking about isn't necessarily the worst kind of attack you can get.
I agree.
Right? An attack where they exfiltrate confidential data and they don't just deny you access to your network is potentially much worse, right? And what does the law of most states require you to do when you've been hacked in that way, i.e. where you've lost protected data? Why you have to go and notify the people whose data has been compromised of that fact. Well, what do you think many of them are going to do? Right? They're going to explore their legal rights.
Right.
And so now you're talking about potential damages that, number one, and this is maybe more your area than mine, but are likely to be covered by an insurance policy if you have it, but of course not if you don't. And number two goes back to, how do you defend yourself against a case like that? And that's where we were 15 minutes ago, right? Where you need to be in a position where you can put a credible defense to explain that what you did was reasonable under the circumstances.
So let's shift gears a little bit. I mean, you and I could talk about cybersecurity for hours on end, but let's talk about success, business successes. You're a successful attorney. I'd like to hear from you, what do you do that may be unique or maybe not so unique that contributes to your success every day?
Yeah, I mean, To the extent that I'm successful, Gordon, I would say it's all about building and maintaining relationships. It's human connections. It's knowing people who are good people and staying connected with them and being there for them and hoping that they'll be there for you. And there's nothing magic. There's no magic to it, right? There's no secret sauce. If I've gotten better at anything that I think has helped me over the years, I think I've gotten better at understanding the needs of the people in my network and being more responsive to them. To me, that's the most important thing that I do.
And I'll say, I think you're being a little humble because I think you do have the secret sauce. And I think it's overlooked by a lot of people. You do a really good job of staying in touch with people like me and a lot of other folks I know that are within the networks that we work within. And you make an effort to reach out and make connections and just see what's going on. It's an old worn out phrase that the word work is in networking and there is work to be put into it. But I think you do a good job there. Tell me a little bit about attorney-client relationships and how those blossom under the work you do.
Yeah, great question. And it's really not that different, right? At the end of the day, an attorney and a client are just two human beings, or maybe more, whatever, however many's in that particular relationship, all working to solve problems. I want, to the extent that I can, I want my clients to not dread picking up the phone to call their lawyer. I want them to view it as a positive experience to the extent that I can. I want to try to understand what is keeping them up at night and try to help them, solve those problems. And I want to do the same kinds of things that I would do with any human relationship, to be there for them, and to anticipate what their needs might be and to try to be there with good solutions for them. So it seems simple, but and I guess it is, but it's as simple or as complex as any other human relationship.
That's right. You mentioned something interesting. You talked about the issues that are keeping people up at night. What are the biggest challenges that business owners are facing today? We're just kind of coming out of the pandemic. We still have COVID issues to deal with. We've got kind of a lopsided economy. Some people are doing really well with the economy, others aren't. What do you see with your clients as some of the key challenges they're facing today?
Yeah, so it depends on the business they're in. So some of my kind of restaurant type clients, or let's say cash business type clients, they're struggling because they were so hard hit by COVID from an economic perspective. And I've got clients who are still, whether they're a restaurant or a theater or whatever, that are still trying to get money from the SBA under PPP programs. They're hurting. They really need that money. So that keeps them up at night. And dealing with whatever their legal issues might be against that economic backdrop, I get a sense as to how stressful their lives could be. So that's sort of one set. You've got another set who are dealing with a lot of the remote work issues, just trying to get through the pandemic. The pandemic was really hard from an employment law perspective for a lot of companies, right? You remember back in March of 2020, March, April, May, like everyone thought the sky was falling.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And everyone was gonna slash their workforces. And then the PPP programs were announced and people began to realize, well, maybe we can hang in there. And that went back, and then they had to go back and revise their workforce strategies again. And then as business has been better or worse or whatever the case may be, it's been a constant challenge. And then the laws have been changing, right? We had the COVID protection leaves that were on the legal landscape last year that are not so much on the landscape this year. But now we've got the challenges of people coming back to work and figuring out, what are we going to do with people who don't want to get a vaccine? Are we going to let them come back to work? How are we going to make the workplace comfortable for everybody, regardless of their political beliefs, as we have an increasingly polarized, workforce, in at least some workforces, in terms of politics and in terms of how they feel about being vaccinated and all of these issues. It's a tough time to manage employees.
Yeah. One of my last questions is do you think that the last 15 months has taught or built resiliency in the minds of business leaders?
I think so. Right. If they've survived, right. Some have been knocked out, right. Not all businesses have survived.
Yeah.
Right. And those who have survived have taken a body blow and survived. Right. And that has taught them a lot about what they need to do to survive, who has their back while they're going through a tough time. Right. To take the old expression, never let a good crisis go to waste, right, and apply it here, right? Never has there been a better time for service providers, like attorneys, I imagine, like insurance brokers, right, to show their people that they're with them, and that they're engaged with them under very challenging circumstances.
Yeah. I think that you could probably build out an entire portfolio of content around resiliency today and lessons learned. You could even probably have a consulting practice around it if it doesn't already exist. There's, what the last year and a half, I think, has taught me and a lot of other people is that you do need to kind of take a step back, recount where you are, where you're going. In the Strategic Coach program, which is an entrepreneurial program, they talk about the gap, where you get stuck in the gap. You feel like you're not making enough progress. And the fix to that is you have to look in your rear view mirror. If we look in our rear view mirror from today, 12, 15, 16 months ago, yeah, the sky was falling. Everybody's hair was on fire. It was horrible. And now we're facing a whole bunch of different issues, risks, challenges, that I think are just really weighing on a lot of business owners, and they're kind of waiting for that other shoe to drop. So I think you're right. I think for you, for me, for the listeners that are in that kind of consultative role with their clients, now may be a really good time to tell clients, hey, I've got your back. You want to talk? Let's have a conversation. And it doesn't have to be a product sale. It doesn't have to be selling more services. It just be a conversation around what's on your mind.
Yeah. You anything you can do to have those conversations is a good thing.
I agree. So I want to be respectful of our time today. Any last thoughts that maybe you want to kick into the conversation?
No, I think this has been great. I really want to thank you for inviting me onto your program, Gordon. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Same here, John. Thank you very much for being on today. This is Gordon Coyle wrapping up today's conversation with John Trofimo from Morit Hach. Great conversation around employment and cybersecurity laws, issues and thoughts that we've all been through over the last year and a half or so. I hope you enjoyed the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Until next time, have a great day. Take care.
That's it for this week's episode of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. In the meantime, find more interviews and resources at nybusinessleaders.com.